open forums preceding this, dealing with the 5 different best practices forums that have been running for the last 7 weeks. And there's been quite active discussion in those. The purpose of this session is to bring the 5 together, report to you all on where each of the groups has gotten, and talk about their product and next steps and the way forward. So that's quite a lot for us to deal with in 90 minutes. I'd like to invite anyone sitting further back to come and join us at the table. There's lots of space up here if you'd like. And of course that means you've got a microphone in front of you, which will make it easier for you to intervene. My name is Bill Graham. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation and currently a member of the ICANN board. I'd like to open by calling on Constance Beaumelaire from the Internet Society to introduce the session. Constance, please.
Thank you very much, Bill. So I'm Constance Beaumelaire from the Internet Society, Senior Director, Global Policy Partnerships. I'm also a MAG member, and with other MAG colleagues, we've been working on trying to set up this new track for the IGF best practices, in an attempt to have the IGF work towards more tangible outcomes. The IGF is now 9 years old. There are discussions regarding the renewal of its mandate. We know that within a year we should know whether or not the mandate will be renewed and for which duration, 5, 10 years, maybe more. But in any case, what is clear is that coming out of Net Mundial discussions, coming out of other global internet governance dialogues, we hear a call for the IGF to become stronger, to be able to pick up existing but also emerging internet-related issues, with the view again to share best practices and possibly work towards solutions, tangible solutions, of course developed in an open and multi-stakeholder framework. So this year we are launching this new process. It is literally a very baby process. We had 7 weeks to work on 5 tracks, establishing certs for internet security, mitigating spam, developing local content, developing meaningful multi-stakeholder mechanisms, and also online child protection. So very, very tangible, concrete issues. This is not about the global internet governance dialogue with geopolitical issues that influence the discussions. It's really about tangible difficulties that policymakers and other stakeholders need to work together on. So what we've done basically over these past 7 weeks is that we've gathered lead experts, all the people who have developed these best practices with a series of volunteers are from all stakeholder groups. We have the chair of FIRST for certs. We have people from industry, from online protection. We have people from the ITU, again, for the same theme. So literally multi-stakeholder teams enrolling a series of experts. We have about 80 to 120 people who work through mailing lists, webinars. And what's really interesting is that it brings a whole set of new people and experts who initially were not involved in the IGF, who have actually little interest in the global internet governance discussions, but are much more focused on day-to-day work, tangible issues. So these groups have been working with the Secretariat, and John Laprise and Wout Denatrice was supporting the Secretariat in a view to compiling, documenting existing best practices. We now have on the IGF website a repository for each one of those 5 themes with useful resources, links to lead experts, useful documents you can find online, and also the draft outcomes. We have about 15, 16 pages for each of those themes, that go through methodologically a set of questions. We start by defining the issues, then we look at regional specificities, then we look at existing policy measures, but also private sector initiatives. We look at what worked well, what didn't work well, because it's very important to learn lessons from what didn't function very well. And then there's a discussion, there's documentation about issues that remain to be addressed, and also possible identification of common ground among these current best practices. The different drafts are still open for comments until the 15th of September. The IGF Secretariat will be working with the different lead experts to incorporate comments that were expressed during the 5 best practice forums of the IGF. They will also work in comments that will be collected through this session. And then the lead experts will reconnect with their communities to see how they want to take the work forward. But at the end of this IGF week, we already have a draft outcome document. We already have a tangible outcome, and I think this is very pleasing, as it's one of the first ever outcomes of the IGF. So I'll stop there, Bill, and back to you for the introduction of the different themes. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So as I said, we'll go through the 5 different themes one by one. We'll take about 50 minutes to do that, so roughly 10 minutes each. I would ask each of the speakers to please try and make their report in maybe 7 or 8 minutes. That will leave us a couple of minutes for immediate reactions. Then after the 5 presentations, we'll have about 20 minutes more or less for questions from the audience on any one of the 5. But I do want to, if possible, leave a couple of minutes at the end of each section for immediate reactions if you have any. So I will start by asking Avri Doria to speak to developing meaningful multi-stakeholder participation mechanisms. This was the Best Practice Forum where I was a co-moderator along with George Sadowski, and I really want to thank Avri on my and George's behalf for agreeing to make the report today so that I could chair this session. Avri, please.
Thank you. Yes, it was interesting in that I became a 3rd co-moderator, I guess, as it was, or a temporary co-moderator at the sort of last minute, and then went and totally changed the organization of the session on the moderators. I think that this session very much represented a first step. In other words, there was 7 weeks of collection of comments. Multi-stakeholder model, multi-stakeholderism, whatever, has an interesting attribute at IGF in that we've been doing it. We've been doing what we call it, but unlike some of the other areas, like the spam area or the child protection, it isn't something that we've been having workshops on. We have not been having workshops on modalities, workshops on methods over the years. So in a sense, we're starting in the descriptive work sort of at the beginning. Now, of course, there's been a whole lot of experience in it, both in the IGF, in other internet governance fields, and as we started to discover in some other areas where people came up, they either spoke during that session or came up to me afterwards, and you say, you know, we've been doing multi-stakeholder and we've developed a model that we think would be interesting to review and talk about within the context of the work you're doing. So I think it was really quite exciting in that respect, in that we've started taking something that we all think we know implicitly because, well, of course we know what's multi-stakeholderism, what multi-stakeholder is, because we've been doing it. But yet when you ask people to define it, they go, well, I'm not sure I know how to define it. Of course, I have that same problem when I ask people to define democracy for me. We all know what it is, but when you get right down to defining it and all its attributes, it's complicated. So we do have a first set of definitions on the ground, and the document John produced includes those for beginning of discussion. Part of the discussion we had was on definitions and looking at some of the words in the definitions, because one of the first things that happens with a definition is, well, what does this word in it mean? You know, the package looks kind of nice, but what do all these words mean? So we took a little bit of that dive into the second thing. On the list, we talked somewhat about what it means to be a best practice in the first place. And so we're trying to understand, in terms of looking at that, how it is we know when we have a best practice. And I've had a quibble with Constance and others, and when haven't I had a quibble about us calling it best practice. I think at the best, we'll have current best practices. And I'd almost suggest that we look at changing the name, because by the time we print any document, it may be helpful for people that are starting that, but best practices are something that move on. They change as we gain more experience. And we don't want to sort of pretend that we will, in some sense, achieve a best practice for the end of all time. In terms of the issues we looked at, we basically looked at the report that John had created and basically extracted a couple general themes that seemed to be the locus of a lot of the disagreements or agreements or different definitions or different ways of looking at it. For example, stakeholders. What are we talking about? Who's a stakeholder? How do we know that are stakeholders? How do some people view others as a stakeholder? Are the 3 stakeholders of the Tunis agenda the only stakeholders? Wait a second, those aren't stakeholders. Those are stakeholder groups. Is there something about stakeholders that's special and that they aggregate into any number of stakeholders, or does the notion of a stakeholder group come first, and the government have defined the 3 stakeholder groups for us, and therefore, if we are a stakeholder, we must belong to one of those 3. So looking at the questions of stakeholder and stakeholder group, the relation to each other, the definitions, the flexibilities. You know, we didn't get into it too much, but how the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders attach and may be specific to the situation, or maybe not. So that was part of the discussion. We got into trust. We spent a fair amount on trust in terms of one of the criteria of a stakeholder grouping, of a multi-stakeholder process working, is that the stakeholders can trust each other. That they can, you know, feel that when you talk to someone, you're talking straight. You're not going around them. You're not going to take what they say and misuse it. You know, you're not going to take the fact that they were open with you for a few moments and use it against them. And that basically the whole notion of a stakeholder. So how do you gain trust? How do you lose trust? How do you regain trust? And looking at those issues becomes part of it. Accountability and transparency was one of the issues, and as we talked, we realized that it really should be accountability, transparency, and what was the R word? No, not resilience. I've lost it. I didn't write it and I've lost it, but I will find it. But it's basically, can you rely on it? Is it basically dependable? Is it predictable? It wasn't an R word at all. That's why I was confusing myself. Predictability. I apologize to you for having to watch my mental process. So is it predictable? And so perhaps we're expanding the discussion to look beyond just accountability and transparency, but predictability, and how important is predictability in a multi-stakeholder process. So we've basically gotten to the point of opening up a lot of issues. We've got a good paper. We understand that there's going to be two more there's more comments, then there'll be another draft of it. Now, the way we're looking at it is we've got a year's worth of discussions and work to do. We're looking at the notion of ourselves as sort of an outcome working team, whether that name is a good name, a bad name. We knew it couldn't be a working group because this is the UN and we don't do working groups. It isn't a dynamic coalition because it's got a specific task. It's got a finish this task and not be anymore. So we're really looking at how we organize over the next year to continue working on this outcome on multi-stakeholderism, and to see through a variety of on-list work, online work, perhaps some telephone meetings, what have you, sort of still in a very nebulous state, but basically continue working through the year. So that becomes yet another part of this outcome experiment. Not only do we have outcomes after 7 weeks of prep, but can we actually work from one IGF meeting to the next, and actually have a consistent work that sort of takes us from one meeting to the other, so that when we meet in Brazil next year, I guess it's Brazil at the next IGF, we actually have an outcome that we could say, we've worked on, we've reached a certain level of consensus, we understand where the differences are, etc. And I guess in having come up with that notion, I've been volunteered and agreed to volunteer myself to continue working on trying to organize that for the next year, unless people go, oh, what a terrible idea, find somebody else. That's about it.
Thank you, Avery. That was great. Any immediate reactions? We have a couple of minutes for immediate reactions, but as I say, there'll be an opportunity to speak in the session later on. Do I see one here? No? Nothing really pressing? That's great. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Avery. The next set of reports will be on the best practices group looking at creating an enabling environment for the development of local content. And Susan Chalmers and Stuart Hamilton will be speaking to this. Which one first? Susan?
Thank you. Our dialogue unfolded over several weeks, and I'm happy to say that we had robust discussion on the list from all stakeholder groups. Stakeholder participation was truly geographically diverse as well. Technical contributions from Cameroon, Australia, contributions from government officials from Liberia, from Egypt, civil society participation, in particular from Latin America, actually with best practices identified at the LAC IGF and shared to the global to this global group. We also had contributions from European library associations, private sector contributions from North America. So it was really a terrific mélange of voices that kept the discussion lively and engaging. And just a word on process I'd like to share. So as Constance mentioned earlier, the lead experts were to guide participants through an 8-part template, beginning with the definition of the issue and ending with proposed steps for further multi-stakeholder dialogue. What our group elected to do was to take each part at a time, ideally devoting 1 week or less to each of these 8 sub-themes. Unfortunately, given the time constraints and the complexity of this topic, that is creating an enabling environment for the development of local content, we did run out of time, but nonetheless, we did identify we arrived at some insights which I'd like to share right now. So what we did, we started out with trying to define local content, and we came up with a collection of definitions, so it is a broadly defined topic. So with that discussion, we then proceeded to frame the issue in 3 parts. The first part was the technical or infrastructure, the state of the internet industry in the locality. The second part was the regulatory landscape and relevant legislation that affects the creation of local content. And finally, the third area was really examining the human capabilities and capacities issues such as digital literacy, web accessibility, and so on. So in order to kind of package and digest this issue, which is quite multifaceted and complex, we approached the discussion in that way, and I think that it really lent to the success of the conversation. And before I turn to my colleague Stuart, I'd just like to say that one thing, I think probably the best and most important point that we were able to tease out through these 7 weeks of discussion was that there are a number of best practices that were identified that indirectly affect the development of local content creation. So for example, I'll just give one example that came up during the discussion. A requirement of local hosting, for example, of information within a jurisdiction may in turn lead to investment within data centers and servers in that jurisdiction, which would in turn lead to reduction of latency and faster traffic delivery, which would in turn lead to people being able to contribute and upload their content far easier. So that's an example of an indirect policy. What we did come to, we came to the conclusion that there are not that many policies or best practices that were identified that directly facilitate the creation of local content. So I think that the true value of the discussion was that we identified that. So with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Stuart.
Okay, I have to lean in quite a long way here. So yeah, I think Susan's covered an awful lot there about what was actually a very wide-ranging discussion over the quite short period of time that we had. But we got quite a lot of information out of it. Of course, there's a lot still to be discussed. The area of policies is most definitely, I think, the main area. Policies that don't exist yet was the phrase that came up on the list discussion. We got plenty of examples in the discussion of sort of what was happening at national levels, and the development of local content was sort of happening as a byproduct of some sort of related or unrelated policies. But in terms of an absolutely direct policy framework for the creation of local content, it didn't seem to be coming out. We think that user-generated content is the second area where there's a lot more to be discussed. It's clearly an issue. It's been discussed here at the IGF as well. How is that to be encouraged? How does it come out to be treated in relation to so-called professional content? And that also came out a little bit at our session a couple of days ago. And the third area I'd sort of highlight, which still needs to be addressed in this discussion, is one that I think I'd have to bring into the mix from a librarian's perspective, which is that the actual phrase local content still isn't actually translating amongst a substantial profession that deals with it nearly every day. And I found that very interesting to sort of try to talk to my colleagues, get them involved in the discussion. IFLA's got members in 150 countries, so we put this very far across the network. And they say, local content, we've never heard of it. And I point out that they're working with it, and, oh, you mean, yeah, so-and-so. But I think that's something that even though our paper's very clear on the difficulty of defining local content, I found that an issue I'm sure we're going to pick up again in the future. Just turning to sort of how we can connect the best practices with policy discussions at local and national levels. We found that it was useful to circulate requests to get involved through IFLA's network, which I mentioned is quite big. This is certainly something which can be replicated with everybody's network to get these new documents out there for more comment. It's a relatively easy one. I think there's definite room for discussion of these subjects at the regional IGFs and at the national IGFs. Again, a pretty simple thing, I think, to achieve. And then a final sort of comment on the role of the volunteer lead experts. I think we're quite proud of what we accomplished in the 7 weeks that we took this on, but it was quite intensive. There was a lot more work than perhaps we expected. Fortunately, we would now have 12 months to really work on this going forward. But I think we need to think quite carefully about how much work we need to put in to make this really happen, maybe increase the size of teams dealing with it. As anyone knows, trying to prolong a mailing list discussion requires constant prods and moving people in the right direction. So I think those sort of things need to be taken on board. Thank you.
Thanks to you both. That's really helpful, and I appreciate the comments on the methodological issues, if I can put it that way. That's going to be helpful going forward. Any immediate reactions or questions on local content? Yes, Marilyn Cade, please.
Thank you. Stuart, it's good to see you, and Susan. And I was actually very pleased to see that we took this topic up as one of the best practice forums because of the, as most of us who were participated in the WSIS recall, this area of local content was one that was called for in the action lines. And we've seen the, I think, the growing importance of the development of local content as more and more users come online. So, but what seemed to me to be a big gap was an understanding of what was really happening, what was really going on and were there any success stories that could be leveraged. So I applaud the fact that you guys took this on in such a short period of time, but I'm wondering, have you already identified scalable ideas from what you've seen so far that you think could be taken further?
Well, we're also fortunate enough to have John with us as well, who wrote the content of the paper. I think from my perspective, I'm still waiting to see some scalable policies. But as I mentioned, we got a number of national sort of case things. And John, maybe you want to just say a couple of things about that, if I can possibly get this to you.
Here we go. Hi, John LaPrise for the record. I think from all the work I've looked at and everything I've been reading for the past, 2 months and then plus before that, the best way to facilitate local content is to focus on the users. I mean, the infrastructure is important, the law is important, but so much content is created that's non-commercial that if you give someone a smartphone and you give them inexpensive access to data, they're going to create. They're going to go on. We're going to be creative on their own and create content. And facilitating users to create content will create demand for local services, which will drive the engine for the infrastructure providers. It will prompt government to adopt new laws to meet those needs. So I think it's all about starting with the users, from my perspective. The other things, there are a lot of discussion about how for some local infrastructure providers, especially IXPs, have a chicken and egg kind of problem where they can build an infrastructure, but it's very expensive and they have to take the risk that they're going to to have enough local customers to make it cost effective. And if they don't, then local users will then trombone and use foreign services, and this is problematic from their perspective. So I think it really comes down to, in terms of a scalable sort of global policy, the best thing is to put your faith in the individual user and give them the means to create content and just let them run.
Thank you, John. One very fast follow-up, Marilyn.
I just want to make a quick clarification. I actually wasn't thinking about global scalability. I used the wrong word, and you don't need to respond. I'll come back. And I was actually thinking about replicability within other communities that might be similar. So I'll take that up separately, but I now realize I actually asked my question wrong.
Thank you. And a quick question from Subi, please.
Thank you. John, this is Yeah, that's the voice of God narration. This is Subhi Chaturvedi from India. I have a related question for Susan and John. I work and teach in a college in India, and what we do is we take $10 cell phones and give it to the girls. It's a women's college, and they go out to the community, and the community produces content. This is an issue that's identified both in the Tunis agenda and as something that we're looking at the IGF to do better and speak to more. Is there both looking at push and pull factors, barriers to upscaling of local content? Is there a resource pool that you intend creating where you would have mentorship from industries, private sector, syndicates, and the government that will look at help in terms of language, local language dissemination, and also best practices and integration of pull-ups that can be given to communities which are creating local content? And what is the intersessional work that you intend to do in terms of dissemination of practices?
Susan Chalmers, excuse me, sorry. Thanks, Subi. Thanks, Marilyn. One thing that did come up during the discussion was, and I think, Subi, this relates to your question, to your query, is the presence of innovation hubs in certain countries. So that is where you do have a place where different stakeholders can converge, and it's also a capacity building opportunity. So we have heard of instances of those innovation hubs. I believe a few are identified in the African region, but I'd have to go back into the mailing list and check and get back to you. So I think that taking those innovation hubs and understanding how they're constructed and how they're supported, how maybe if they're subsidized, whether by government or by private sector, would be a really good place to start looking. In terms of the modality going forward, after a session, which was on the first day of the IGF, the participants and the panelists, we've agreed that it would be really good to meet. We're trying to find some time tomorrow, but you know the IGF is a movable feast. But so we're going to try and meet and discuss how to take this forward, because there is, of course, a question of resources. So I've dedicated my time gratis, to this, and it's important to find people who are capable of being able to take this forward and be dedicated. So whether that's through volunteer or not, we're going to have to figure that one out. But I would really love to see this unfold and see the outcome document produced on a consensus basis. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Susan. I'll take one more. I saw a hand up back in the audience there, and then we'll have to move forward. Good, thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ankush, and I am the ISOC ambassador at IGF. And I have one question to the panel. So we are going towards a world where there's a lot of internet fragmentation because of local as well as global factors. But till date, technology has driven the internet. So do you guys think that going forward, is it the technology that will drive the best practices, or we will go towards an era where local factors will guide towards the best practices? Thank you.
Services, whether or not services.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make a really boring answer and say both, which is, hedging my bets a little bit, I guess. But it's almost certain that we're going to see local practices, the way that local people engage with their information environment, drive what they do with it, and it's almost certain that something's going to come along in a technological sense that we don't know about yet that's going to make it even easier to develop local content. So not perhaps the greatest answer in the world, but...
No, sorry, this is Susan Chalmers. I think that's absolutely correct, and it relates to the structure of the discussion. So again, going back to the three-part structure, this issue has been described as a virtuous cycle, I guess you could say. So it's the development of technology and the ability of technology to be able to be placed into the hands of users will then enable them to create, and it just keeps on driving. So I think that all of these factors play a role together, and so I think your boring answer is absolutely correct.
Good, thank you, and thanks for your interest in this topic. Remember, there will be opportunities to discuss this further after the remaining three reports. So please make a quick note so you don't forget what you wanted to raise with us. The third Best Practices Forum is the one on establishing and supporting certs for Internet security. And Adli Wahid is going to report on this. Adli, please.
Thank you very much, Bill. Hello, everyone. My name is Adli Wahid from FIRST, and I am one of the lead experts for this forum, the other two being Christine Hoppers, sitting next to me from CERT Brazil, and Martin van Horenbach is at the back here. So that's three of us, and like everyone else, we started this process of getting inputs to produce the best practice document about 7 weeks ago. At one point, well, I think still now, we have about 90 people on the mailing list, and for every WebEx session that we held, we had good participation from members, mostly from the technical community. And only until today, we had a lot of good inputs from the other stakeholders, and we had a lot of good questions and discussion, which I will be discussing next. Before I begin with the report on the consensus and the questions that we get, I'd like to, for the benefit of those who are not part of our forum, tell you a little bit what the acronym CERT stands for. So CERT, or as you will notice, we will use CCERT later on. CERT, or CCERT, is basically Computer Security Incident Response Team, CCERT. It's a service organization that is responsible for receiving, reviewing, responding to a computer security incident. And their services are usually tied to a defined constituency. It could be a government, it could be an enterprise, it could be an educational network, or research network, or paid client in some cases. And when we mention the word incident, we are actually referring to real or suspected adverse event in relation to a computer security system or computer networks. And I think it's very useful to define that, because otherwise you'll get all sorts of ideas on what is emergency or what is an incident, and so on. So as I said before, when producing this draft document, we had a lot of input from people in the technical community, particularly people who are working with CCERTs. And I'd like to highlight some of the points that received consensus. The first one is on the term itself. So instead of using the word CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, we wanted the usage of the acronym CCERT in the document for the sake of accuracy and also consistency. Part of it is because the word emergency can lead to some misunderstandings and misconceptions about the work that we are dealing with. And there are many other communities that work in emergencies, such as natural disaster and things like that, but we are nothing like that. Second point is that there are different kinds of CCERTs, and their constituencies and services may differ, but all of us are connected one way or the other, because the main purpose of CCERT is to respond to security incidents, to mitigate the risk or the damage that it could cause the constituency. CCERT has been working for a long time, in fact, since 1998, when the first CERT was established. And much of this is due to the need to respond to similar threat or incidents. And there was a consensus in the group, in the discussion, that the success of CCERT is tied to delivering what has been promised, and managing the other stakeholders in terms of perceptions and responding to the need of the stakeholders. There are a lot of guidelines and best practices out there on how to establish, how to run a CERT, or how to manage a CERT. And we included this in the document as references, and we did not want to actually deliberate further more on that, and just use our best practice document as something that people come and see and refer to them if needed. There was also some discussion, interesting discussion on the role of government in starting or establishing certs in nations and in organizations. The conclusion or the consensus that we get from the participant of the discussion is that top-down approaches from government on creating CSIRT do not always work well, and a bottom-up approach was preferred, was much preferred. And there's a lot of work that CSIRTs do, and the success of doing a lot of the response work that is tied closely to the question of trust. So as in, I think in other discussion of other forums, here today we hear the word trust. So creating trust, establishing trust is a key thing in many of the CERT work. And as I said earlier, cooperation is rooted in trust, and sometimes the legislation does not provide or does not facilitate the work of CERTs, and in some cases it may impede the communication and the exchange of information and the need to respond to security incidents. And there was also the discussion that because security response work is very important, there is a need to have what we call in our community, in our own language, the CSIRT of last resort, which means that you must have a point of contact somewhere, right, to be able to make sure that incidents are not causing damages or problems. Because otherwise, there will be no way to communicate or no way to contact a party or an entity to resolve a particular incident. Now, as I said earlier, when we had the session this morning, we had very, very good feedback as well as questions. And I would like to highlight them, and we categorize this in as unresolved issues, something that we would like to further look into after this. So there was comments on the need to define further or refine further the definition of national CSIRT and the CSIRT of last resort, as I mentioned earlier. We need to sort of, because today was the only opportunity to actually get inputs from those outside the CSIRT community, and we find it very beneficial. So there was a need to open up this document to other communities to get reviews, to get feedback, and get more questions so that we can improve it. There was some questions on the cost of participation of developing countries in the CSIRT community. And I think that is interesting for future debate and get further inputs from those who are actually thinking of running a CSIRT in the future. There were also some good questions and feedback on the role of CSIRT teams in addressing the root causes of incidents, such as prevention of cybercrime, or creating cyber awareness programs. And this is an area that we thought, a multi-stakeholder discussion would be very, very beneficial. For example, working with law enforcement agencies and whatnot. So moving forward, we thought that the whole exercise was very, very useful, and the sentiment that we get was that, there must be some mechanism to put forward some of the work that we had already, together with the open questions into some other venues for comments, maybe at the national or regional IGF meetings, so that we can refine some of the contents of the best practice document. And I think with that, I would like to end my report, and hopefully if there is any question, we'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that report. Any immediate reactions or questions? I see one here. Subi, please.
Adil, thank you for that very comprehensive report. Coming from a democracy like India, there is great diversity both in language and cultures, and certs have been important questions of concern for us. So two specific inputs taking off from where you touched upon the role of governments, because a lot of practices that we're talking about are best practices that we would like to see as a community of internet users. In terms of outreach, what is the process of engaging more with governments and intelligence agencies in particular, because a lot of times we've seen human rights trampled upon in instances where it might be a cause for immediate concern, and and also dissemination, because there is no one-size-fits-all as far as certs are concerned. So are you looking at responding to those questions in larger outreach, because the work that you're doing is invaluable?
Hi, I'm Christine Hoppers. I'm also one of the co-leads from CERT Brazil. This was a discussion that was touched a lot. The document covers a lot. And when some of the confusion, and I think some of the confusion with the roles of like intelligence agencies or police and everything, it goes with semantics, it goes with really calling it emergency, because people think and react in a different way. And this was a sentiment from everyone that was discussing that it's really not helping a lot, because the work that we do is a work that's a network of teams. It's very diverse, and this is one of the points that we really try to make clear in the document from all the inputs for people, that there's not one model. We have as many diverse teams as we have, the better we can have the security. And today, some of the discussions were addressing that maybe we need to make that even more clearer, because there were several questions in our best practice session, and we didn't have time in the session to go to the whole document. But most of the discussion was exactly about to explain better what it is, and not to confuse like national cybersecurity strategies and police and security with incident response. So, and this is why one of the findings, as Adli said, that it would be nice to have more the other stakeholders involved into bringing what they expect of this process and what are their questions and what is not clear, because sometimes it's not clear for us. Although we had certs and C-certs from all the stakeholders, they were more the technical and security people in there. So we had already an input from certs from different areas on what are the perceptions, and we think that's invaluable to have the IGF and the local IGFs and national IGFs to contribute with especially some points that will be open for discussion, like regional specificities. We brought what we knew from the regions we want, but we know that some are not mapped yet. But I think it's very important that you brought this.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move now to the fourth report, and this is on the the Best Practice Forum dealing with regulation and mitigation of unwanted communications, for example, spam. And I'll call on Karen Mulberry to speak to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And that's quite a mouthful. We looked at ourselves as addressing spam and moved forward with that and as the short term, rather than kept calling ourselves with that very long regulation and mitigation of unwanted communications. We've had a lot of discussion on our list about various aspects of the report framework that MAG provided to us in terms of establishing what is the issue, how would we qualify it, how would we approach the information and collecting the important best practices. In that dialogue and exchange, determined that there are a lot of expert groups out there that have been working on this issue for quite some time. The London Action Plan contributed information from an intergovernmental perspective. The MOG, which is the Messaging Anti-Abuse Working Group, works on operational best practices affiliated with spam. So they contributed to developing our draft document. There are other groups. The ITU, in our discussion yesterday, indicated that they had significant work that they were going to also contribute into building out our collection of best practices. So I think we're starting to build a lot of information. The GSMA indicated that they have a lot of work that they have done, specifically as it relates to mobile spam. And so that is going to be added into our document. Since we only had 7 weeks as well, it was rather difficult for lots of these organizations to have the opportunity to meet themselves, to interact and contribute. So I'm anticipating through the open comment period that we have, that we'll have more information that comes in. We did have some discussion yesterday in terms of, are we unwanted or are we unsolicited? In terms of the title, there were different perspectives and issues associated with the term unwanted in the title. There appeared to be a preference amongst the participants to call us regulation and mitigation of unsolicited communication instead. There was a lot of context around unwanted that created angst. So that is one proposal that we might want to consider in terms of recasting the name of this forum a little more appropriately. I think we have had a lot of dialogue. We had some good support from a lot of groups and participants in building out the draft that we have. So we're going to continue to collect that kind of information. And what we discovered in our discussion yesterday in our session was that there's a lot of work to continue with. One aspect that we really didn't touch upon much was the user aspect. We looked at what governments have done. We've looked at what networks have done and need to do. We've looked at some of the RFCs and other mail management and authentication. But we haven't really looked at or framed user aspects. There's also, as we all know, that spam migrates, and it's not just email anymore, that it's moving into other platforms, much like the mobile industry indicated, through text messaging and SMS. Spam is now appearing on VoIP. It's now appearing in social media platforms. So I think we have other avenues that we actually need to gather more information on so that we can build out the practice and really cover all of the aspects that I think would be useful in some sort of compendium on best practices. So we hope to continue through the next year and work on these future things, I think, that would round out the work that all the other organizations have contributed to date.
Good, thank you very much. So you've decided to extend your group's work into the next year?
Yes, we have. I mean, in particular sense, the spam is in essence a delivery mechanism of things, and it delivers malware, botnets, and phishing attacks. It is now moving into other platforms like social media that also become the platform for malware, botnets, and phishing attacks. So, we need to look at that a little more in depth. We did not have time to do that right now. So we have gaps that we need to fill in terms of the work that we have. So we'd like to continue.
Thanks for that clarification, Karen. Time for a couple of pressing points. I see at this mic here.
Good afternoon, Alejandro Pisanti. Very briefly, I think this piece of work was very useful and exhaustive in its coverage within its scope. I think that further there's at least two things I would like to see addressed and would join to contribute for the next year. One of them is the drivers for spam. As long as you don't touch the drivers, everything else is filigree. When you want to touch the drivers, you want to touch the actual commerce that's being made, the money that's being moved, and the naivete with which some people react, especially also when spam becomes the spread for malware and so forth. Second point is that in looking at this problem, especially from the Internet Governance Forum perspective, which is very much focused on development and developing economies and so forth, we should not only look at spam, but at anti-spam. Anti-spam hurts small businesses in developing countries more than spam. Spam takes away their capacity at servers, it drains capacity from the routers and from network capacity, but anti-spam actually hits these guys, hits these small companies and civil society organizations even harder. They are sending out email blasts, advertisings, billing, and so forth, and these are not sent with quality enough to pass the filters. So they're actually spending a lot of money also in the outgoing, which is wasted.
Good points. Thank you very much. Do you want to respond, Karen, or?
Thank you, Alejandro. We did have some brief comments on those points yesterday. Not only the cost of spam, but the cost to networks and what they have to do to mitigate spam. So, that is a topic I think we will take up as future work in trying to see if there's some way to categorize, describe, define, what those costs are. I don't think we can get down to the dollar values of things because that's going to be a little subjective. But we can have, based on some examples from operators and others, understand the costs that impact them. And then in terms of reputation, we talked a little bit about the Nigerian 419 episode that happened in the late 80s and is now recurring over and over again, which has created a very bad reputation for a country that may or may not be the one that is sending out all of that spam, but as a result, a lot of their traffic has been blocked just because it's coming from Nigeria. And so how do we approach the reputational impacts that spam causes and address them in a better light, so that the small organizations don't get caught in spam filters and others who are trying to do legitimate email don't get caught up in things that prevent their commerce.
Good, thank you. And a point here from Oud.
I'm Walter Nautis. I'm the rapporteur of this group and the consultant for the UN. Coming from what Karen is saying and what we had in the session yesterday, two thoughts that came to my mind is that one, it seems like the interest of governments, so not governmental agencies, because they were in the room even traveling here to comment in person, but from governments seems to be waning for the topic of spam, because the spam is not a problem anymore. It's no longer in our inboxes in Western countries, so they have left the table in the past years apparently. And how do we get them back? Because we did get through yesterday that the cost on industry is rising tremendously. Apparently the cost is large for companies to mitigate spam and not have it in our inboxes. So I think that is an economic driver that should be put better on the table, coming from the discussion yesterday. And the second one, and that escapes me at this moment, I'll come back somewhere later, and then you know what it's about, and I'll be back with it. So sorry for that.
Thank you very much. I think we'll turn to our fifth report now on the Best Practices Forum on online child protection, and I'd like to invite Jacqueline Beaucher to report, please.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Jacqueline Beaucher from Microsoft, and I had two other lead experts on this Child Online Protection Best Practices Forum with me, Hannah Broadbent from ChildNet International in the UK, and Carla Licciardello, the head of the Child Online Protection Initiative with the ITU. Like the other groups, we started the process about 7 weeks ago. We had a robust network and mailing list, and we received a number of official responses to the initial question set ahead of today's on-site meeting. Responses came from NGOs, from international organizations, and from one IT company, that would be my own. Today's Best Practices Forum brought together about 100 people from 6 continents, representing all segments of the multi-stakeholder dialogue, including 3 youth panelists, and we had several youth participants as well. I think the group gained a better understanding and appreciation of the broad range of issues that falls under the rubric of child online protection and child online safety, as well as sort of the differing levels of magnitude of the various issues that they carry in different countries and different regions. So the main differences stem primarily from varying degrees of access and availability to technology and the internet, as well as cultural and societal and familial differences and values. The topics of blocking and filtering of illegal and inappropriate content, as well as the ongoing need for public awareness raising and education, both formal and informal education, these were two prominent themes that emerged during today's discussion. That said, nearly everyone agreed that any child online safety strategy needs to be a multi-pronged approach comprised of a technology component, a legal and regulatory mechanisms, law enforcement participation, public-private partnerships, and of course awareness raising and education. All also agreed that there's no one single solution in this space. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, based again on, of course, on the geographies and the cultural differences, and even differences between any one single family unit. As we pointed out, an approach that might work for child protection or child safety within one geography certainly won't work in another geography, and it might not even work within the same family. It might not be the same thing for one child or his or her twin. In terms of remaining issues, again, given the vast array of subtopics that make up this broad space of child online protection, from the availability of child sexual abuse material and online bullying, to the need for digital and media literacy, and the varying degrees to which individual issues present, again, based on geography, access, availability, and so forth, the issue set really needs to be better defined. So we need to be able to hone that issue set and be able to determine the appropriate strategy moving forward, and then to achieve, of course, maximum impact. As I said, we had the pleasure of having youth at the table and in our session. Both the youth panelists and the youth participants were very actively engaged. We do firmly believe that youth need to be present and participate in the dialogue when decisions are being made about their uprising, really, their participation, and when policy is being crafted about them. They too echoed the need for continued awareness raising and formal and informal education, not only of themselves, not only of the children and the teens, but of all stakeholders. They wanted to see continued education for parents, for teachers, for school officials, for coaches, for counselors, anyone who could constitute a trusted adult in their eyes, and the community at large, of course, as well. Several in the group highlighted similar parallel work streams, particularly of the ITU and of other international organizations, that could be leveraged and integrated into this effort and then enhanced going forward. So I think that's really something to keep in mind for this continued work stream. That said, the group saw today's discussion and the work done to date very much as sort of a starting point for a broader dialogue going forward. And going forward, we are inviting additional inputs and feedback. These further perspectives are needed to sort of round out the picture of the global landscape. We had a lot of participation from Europe and North America today. They were perhaps the most vocal, but we're also inviting participation from other geographies, particularly the Global South, where we need some other research-based and evidence-based information going forward. The notion of child protection in context arose during today's dialogue, and that sort of highlighted the need to discover and learn about a broader array of contexts in which child protection issues and child online safety issues could arise. I think this would help the group recommend more appropriate strategies and practices as needed. And then I would finally echo the sentiment that was shared earlier about the title of best practices. Participants were actually very reluctant to put forth any of their strategies as so-called best practices, given sort of their appropriateness for circumstances and situations, but not necessarily for all circumstances and situations. So again, they're very much of the moment, the practices that are being shared, not necessarily best practices that will sustain us going into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Any pressing issues? Marilyn, please.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I was thrilled to see this topic selected as one of the best practice topics, but I guess I continue to struggle, and I should probably announce that I started my career as a child abuse and neglect worker in the United States. I guess I should, and evolved into doing a lot of work in the uses of online services by youth and children. A lot of what I hear is about the risk and dangers, and yet we really need to move into an empowered and environment that also recognizes. Have you begun breaking that out as well?
Thank you, Marilyn. First, to your point about sort of the risks and the dangers, a lot of people like to look at the online environment first from that positive perspective. So we, for instance, at Microsoft want to talk about the transformational power of technology and really highlight the benefits of the internet and technology for youth, and indeed for all populations as a starting point. Certainly, it's not without risk, so we need to acknowledge the risk, but we also want to differentiate risk from harm and possibility of something bad happening versus probability. So we want to make sure that we are focusing on actually risk as opportunity as well, not only risk as a potential danger. So that did come up, and also in terms of positivity, it came up this afternoon, someone raised it in the dialogue about creating positive content, that we need more positive content out there for youth, and particularly for young people, not just to focus on, again, the risks and the dangers and the harm that could come.
Thank you. I see Alejandro Pasanti has a question or comment, please.
Thank you. Sir, can you hear me? It's not my fault. Okay, here's one. Thank you. Alejandro Pisanti. Can you hear me there? There's two comments. One of them is that we see a lot of work, as Marilyn has said. What you see publicly is always the scary part. And there's people like Barry Aftab, whom I would like to see invited again into this kind of work, who have a balanced approach where you can both push for the opportunity and, of course, prevent the actually real risks. There are many ideological strains that come together here, and we should be making them broader, inviting more of them. The second comment, which I think goes to the methods and substance of the work, I see most of the wording, at least, of proposals and reports based on things like education, families, and so forth, that have a hidden assumption, or seem to have a hidden assumption of parents being present or being part of the game. There is a house, there is a school. And I think that the kids that are, let's say, or the young people that are much more at risk and also may become a very serious risk are either homeless or in dysfunctional conditions within families and foster homes and so forth. I see too little of an approach to that, which is, I think, even more critical. But of course, their parents are not there to ask for you to help them.
This has come up in the dialogue, and it has come up in other conversations as well. It's very much something to consider, but for the most part, we have been looking at more of the traditional family setting where there is an active parent, but we are acknowledging that there are situations certainly where that is not the case, and we're not talking about a traditional family unit always.
Good, thank you. I see we have a question from a remote participant, which we'd like to take, and then I'd like to invite everyone in the room to address any of the topics at that point. Thanks.
Good afternoon. This is a comment from Carla at the ITU. And Carla would just like to highlight the fact that there is a problem in terms of information sharing, and the fact that there is lack of parental knowledge, and that fathers must also be included in the trainings and that this perhaps should also be added to the report on best practice, as well as risk prevention education, and then digital literacy must also include aspects of safety.
Good, thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions or comments, please. And I see one at the table here. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Virat Bhatia from AT&T. Two comments quickly. One on the multi-stakeholder work that has been done by, led by Avery. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I think the definition of multi-stakeholderism as conceived in the Tunis Agenda has evolved manifold. The manner in which it was divided, the kind of segments that were made have changed dramatically. Their work has evolved a lot. And I think some of them were mentioned sort of in a bit of a cursory manner. Now they are mainstay. So I guess some of that work in terms of what is the role for multi-stakeholders, if that can be kind of the focused discussion at the next stage on multi-stakeholderism. It states something like industry should sort of look after innovation or something. But there is the whole investment issue. Civil society is even sort of weaker language, but it's now in privacy, human rights, all of those issues. So I think that is one part that I thought I'll just mention, not seeking an immediate response, but just for the continued work. The second part that I thought I'll point out for in terms of what are the themes that we can take forward. I think CERT and online are two good themes only because I think the governments will look for those, will want to participate in those in some way if it becomes an organized process for discussion. One of the biggest challenges in taking the best practice discussion forward will be rules of engagement. Right now this was like a smaller community, but if you want national engagements, you'll need rules of the road, rules of engagement, signposts, etc. That's how people are used to. Even if you're not driving towards a negotiated document, there are many stakeholders who are used to working in a certain way and process. We don't have to adopt the UN processes, but we'll have to evolve ourselves away from the current process, which is perhaps the one net list is the, some of the work that's happened there. We'll have to sort of look at something different. But I also want to recommend for best practices session M2M, and here is why I recommend it. It sort of ticks many back boxes. It is multi-stakeholder. The governments, especially in developing countries, are right now hungry for what should be the policy to move from people to people, internet to people, to things and things, people, internet. We've talked to many governments and they're looking for how is it done, how are everybody else doing it, have they started, where have they reached? That's one big area of information hunger that exists in the government. So if you want to get governments in, as the comments were made in the last session, this is one area where you can really get them. And it's also cool, it's technology, it can involve, it will certainly involve the technical communities because the rules of the game are a little different from SIM cards roaming with human beings and SIM cards roaming with machines. Academia has contributions to make. There are privacy issues that might come up in civil society. It is certainly qualifies as the best practice session because it can really start writing stuff that national regulators can refer to. This is the kind of stuff that they're going to go forward, and this is not, this is just documents that are put out there which they can refer to because of the discussion that happened. I'll close by saying that it ticks the developing country box, it ticks the emerging issues box, and there was one thing said yesterday about getting ICT-linked industries or sectors into, industries, sectors into IGF. So this immediately brings in automobile, banking, and equipment. So certainly you have one subject that expands from telcos and software companies to now 5 new kind of companies and sectors that want to jump in. And ministers. And it is also an issue of global cooperation. And most importantly, it's positive. It's forward-looking. It's stuff that everybody can contribute, work on, and stuff. I'm sorry I have to leave because there's another meeting that I have to take, but I just thought I'll leave the thought about M2M with you as a discussion. We're happy to contribute whichever way to move that along I know that ICC bases will be happy to contribute. All the other stakeholders would. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Those are excellent points. They are very future forward-looking and touched on a number of the best practice forums we've had this time. So I'd like to ask if any of the rapporteurs would like to say anything. Woot, I see. No? Okay, we'll certainly have noted those, and I appreciate the contribution. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
My name is Walter Natus. I promised to come back with point 2, so I do. One of the comments that struck me in the session yesterday was it's all about the money. And if you look at what is mostly written in the document so far, it's all about how to mitigate a part of the spam problem, but never go to the heart of where actually the money is made, which is what they're in the business for. So do we actually have the right stakeholders at the table to discuss where the money is going and how to stop the money flow? So in other words, that could be a new way of addressing spam, and also with view of 2015. To come back on a comment that Jacqueline made in general, that with us the name Best Practice Forum also run into some difficulties because they're good practices at best, but everybody has a good practice, and not necessarily a best practice is necessary. So that's also, I think, a piece of feedback and lessons learned from this whole discussion.
Good, thank you. Yes, having been party to discussions at the IGF since its outset, I think we really needed a best practices forum on a new definition or a new phrase to replace best practices. Yes, please, introduce yourself.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. I'm sorry, I will speak French. Okay. Je m'appelle Kossia Messinou, je viens du Bénin, je suis membre du MAG. Je me réjouis déjà qu'on ait eu ce panel spécifique sur les bonnes pratiques. C'est pour nous une expérience spécifique parce que pour les environnements de pays en développement, on aurait souhaité effectivement avoir le partage d'expérience. Mais je pense que l'expression bonne pratique pourrait être transformée par partage d'expérience ou expérience spécifique. Ça pourrait peut-être rassurer mieux les gens, parce que ce qui est bon pour l'autre peut être supposé moins bon pour quelqu'un d'autre. Je voudrais particulièrement mettre l'accent sur les sujets importants, le cadre multi-acteur. On a été heureux lors de notre IGF national que Constance ait voulu faire une présentation à distance sur ces concepts-là. Ça a rassuré la salle. Ça a permis aux acteurs, le gouvernement, de comprendre un peu les enjeux et les éléments qui les concernent et comment est-ce qu'ils pouvaient intervenir dans le dialogue. Le secteur privé de comprendre qu'ils étaient utiles dans ce débat-là, parce que généralement, quand on parle de gouvernance de l'Internet, les acteurs veulent voir les intérêts. Qu'est-ce qu'on gagne à y en parler? Le secteur privé cherche à savoir quel est le retour sur investissement. Quel intervient dans ce débat, quel est le retour sur investissement? Le gouvernement, il se dit, mais ceux-là, ils interviennent sur des sujets qui relèvent de la régulation, des trucs qui m'intéressent, mais ils en parlent à leur niveau. La société civile qui vient avec les idées de volontarisme, on veut que ça change, on veut que ça change, c'est vrai. Chacun des acteurs a un point de vue spécifique. Mais dans la pratique, comment est-ce qu'on gère la responsabilité des trois membres, le secteur privé, le secteur public, la société civile? Comment est-ce qu'elle gère, chacun gère sa responsabilité dans le cadre multi-acteur? Ce sont les expériences de d'autres pays qu'on pourrait partager pour que nous, pays en développement, on puisse vivre, nos gouvernements puissent vivre leurs responsabilités, nos secteurs privés puissent vivre leurs responsabilités et la société civile également. Un autre commentaire que je voudrais faire est relatif à la production de contenus locaux. La notion elle-même est relativement complexe parce que quand on parle de contenu local, ça suppose qu'il est produit dans un environnement spécifique. Il est produit pour une cible spécifique. Mais ce contenu, il est hébergé où? S'il est hébergé hors de cet environnement local, est-ce qu'il devient toujours le contenu local? Est-ce qu'on peut toujours l'appeler un contenu local? Parce que la notion de local suppose qu'il est disponible dans un rayon spécifique. J'ai des données en fond, une langue locale béninoise en fond, et les données sont hébergées aux États-Unis. Est-ce que c'est une donnée locale, c'est un contenu local? Je me pose encore des questions sur ces concepts-là. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for that. So I heard a comment and a question there. Anyone want to address that? No. I see something from the remote participation.
Okay, thank you. This is, I think it's a general comment. It doesn't appear to be a question, but it's coming from K.S. Raju in India. And his comment is that multi-stakeholder considerations at grassroots level, for example, at the level of farmers, are not taken into account. And he makes a specific comment that from the last Net Mondial meeting to this meeting, there is no framework which will address all users and civil society. So it's just a general comment, but it doesn't reference any specific issue within the best practices topics.
Good, thank you. A final comment, please, from Alejandro Pesante, and then we'll move towards closing the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Alejandro Pisante. I will comment on two other panels. First, on the local content. I'm very glad that IFLA has taken a role here because they know how content is generated, classified, made searchable. This is the kind of things that local content needs, but local content is local by definition. I mean, you're calling it local for a reason. There is very little that the global governance dimension can contribute. One of the things that I would propose for this group, if it continues working, is to talk to the few things that can make local content flow, or locally usable content flow from international dimensions. And that would be talking to groups like Francophonie and regional organizations in South Asia or Southeast Asia and in Latin America or Ibero-America, including Spain, where you can have consortia that can produce language, single language content in many countries and thus scale up much faster than a local content place can do. I think that's a proactive thing that this group can do. I will try to join in this effort. The results may be better that way, but still remember the local is local. And also remember, I always remember that the first time we started saying access is not that important an issue anymore, content is king. Content is king is almost 20 years old. We must realize that a lot of people are using the internet for transactions. They may be may be transmitting very few bits and getting a lot of value from that. So we may also be close to the point where we have to reassess the obsession with global governance for promoting local content. Number one. Number two is concerned with the group that addressed multi-stakeholder mechanisms. First, I think that we have to speak about multi-stakeholder mechanisms, organizations, decision-making, etc., but not anymore about multi-stakeholderism, which I think is a generally accepted trend now. This is not a religion or an ideology. It's a practical matter of how you solve things according to principle. One thing that I think we would have to emphasize in the next round, in a following round of this work, after the very good survey that has been done, is why different multi-stakeholder organizations and mechanisms are different. The main and the key point has to be to focus on how form follows function. The IGF is mostly established to have an equal footing participation to discuss things. Things like ICANN have actually to make decisions. They have to allocate resources. They have to have a review and redress mechanisms. They have to be actually able to reverse decisions, which may be costly for the organization and for the participants. So form follows function should be the next question in the investigation of multi-stakeholder governance. And a useful reference, I think I'm very happy about this work, is the strategy panel on ICANN's role in the internet governance ecosystem. That has several parts, and one of them is a solid review of principles that are good guidance for these organizations. Things like reciprocity, which means, for example, that a level of participation in shaping the decisions of a mechanism has to be proportional to what you are obliged if you contribute. Or robustness in many senses, including the fact that these mechanisms will not change very much if you make small changes in their inputs or the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Susan, did you want to respond?
Thanks. I'll keep my comments very short in light of time, which is fleeting. I wanted to acknowledge Kosi's comment. Thank you very much. I thought that was a very kind of clear and cogent example of a lot of the discussions that we've had on the list. And I also wanted to recognize something in what you said, that it's, to a certain extent, the term best practices could be interpreted to imply one best practice, but we understand that there are different shades of best practices. And I think that the value of what this entire exercise has shown is that this is a network of shared experiences and on-the-ground stories and local insights that really, really do well to advance the discussion and to help people learn from each other. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for your intervention.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to turn now to Subi to make some brief comments about future themes for the IGF Best Practices Forums and how the forums fit into the IGF. Thank you. Subi, please.
Thank you, Chair. The best practice forums came out of a call that we had and an open consultation within the MAG and with the community. The IGF is a baby which is now 9 years old. We are getting into the 10th edition next year. It was important to speak to this very important question of what is it that we can take away from here as steps that we can execute in our local settings. So in addition, when we shared these 5 themes, we heard from the audience, the participants and experts in different domains that they'd also like to see one key forum emerge as to how we can look at building digital trust for trade, ICTs, and this was important because it was looking at cross-border flows of information, data, and also getting more people online and enabling small and medium-scale businesses. So we did look at it with the spam perspective, but there were many other enablers that we can look at in different geographical settings. The second very important question related also to dehyphenating child and youth, and the perspective of looking at getting more young people online. How is it that we can remove barriers towards their participation in active policy making and also end user experiences, not just in terms of dangers or threats, but how is it that they're creating more value? Young people are developing applications across the world and now they have fantastic valuation. So this was another aspect that one wanted to look at, and this has come from the floor and from the engagement of the community. And just to quickly wrap up, Constance Baumelier on my left and members from the MAG and the ISOC community initiated this process, which has been truly bottom-up, multi-stakeholder and inclusive. The draft agenda is still online. It's open for comments. The deadline has been extended to the 15th of September. So we request all of you to engage with the document and also come up to us with suggestions in response to this call. And we hope that national and regional initiatives can take some of these ideas and look at them in their local context. Thank you, Chair, for your time.
Thank you, Subi. I'd now like to ask Nii Quaynor to give us some closing remarks. Nii is the chairman of the board of directors of the NTIA. Nii, please.
Yeah. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on IGF evolution and more concrete policy outcomes at this best practices workshop, even though you are redefining what the focus is. I have been honored to have attended the first IGF in Athens as a member of MAG and now participate as an individual. And from that perspective, I share these thoughts. I'm going to remain very high level, but I'll leave one or two notes in there so that we can think through it. IGF has been open, neutral, and inclusive multi-stakeholder platform for policy issues largely beyond the network infrastructure itself. Stakeholders attending IGF are senior and from broad professional disciplines. This has exposed the likes of me to the numerous other issues emerging from the global adoption of the internet, from law to technology. The IGF as a forum has been welcoming and has engaged new entrants over the years as evidenced by physical attendance, not to mention the online engagement. It has become a place to get together and share experiences and exchange information among people of varied interests. And I do recall very early admission by the MAG that the process has a significant value by itself and is an output, result, outcome for many participants going through the experience of participating in IGF. I think this remains true today. In discussions on policy issues, it's important people know who they are speaking to. And the IGF has enabled us getting to know each other than persons with disciplines and practices who are working together, not merely email identities. IGF has been a great place for me to exchange on broad internet governance policy issues beyond what I was familiar with in the technical administration, coordination, and standards processes for infrastructure as a professional. Understandably, the IGF mandate is to foster dialogue without binding decisions and has engendered a desirable, unencumbered, and frank exchange among stakeholders. Would that count as a concrete output? I would favor yes, as it has enabled different points of view to influence each other. This has spurred convergence or understandings among varied disciplines. It has furthermore exposed the complexities of issues around the internet and impact on society and development. For those who quest for more and more concrete outcomes, I advise Festina Lente, as there is half of the world yet to use the internet, and some decisions can have long-range impact and is worthy to take time to build a shared understanding. For those who remind us of the IGF as non-binding dialogue forum character or lack of decision power, I suggest that we are producing outcomes at IGF nonetheless, which gets more concrete year by year. It is therefore gratifying to see a workshop addressing the subject of outcomes and best practices. This will be a continuous process to discuss and improve incrementally on what people accept as concrete outcomes in different areas in a piecemeal fashion. That would be a natural part of the evolution of IGF. It is not perfect, but it's a very good start, and I hope we continue with issue-based policy development to bring focus into the debate. I am pleased additionally, as one of the founders of Africa said, that the session included best practices on CSERT sets and have first participating. This effort, in my opinion, presents a very good opportunity for best practices development. And in addition to other technical efforts, I reckon that several of the proposed enhancements of the notion of documented and valuable output of IGF in discussion today may have been in discussion at MAG or at workshops or participating organizations in events co-located at IGF. Dynamic coalitions, best practices guidelines, BOFs, observatories, clearinghouse, watchdog, IG open data source are all up for grabs. But people must evolve with strong community participation, well beyond engagement at an IGF session today to succeed. This may require intersessional activities and deliberate outreach, as billions are yet to join the internet. However, the value of an output is best determined by voluntary adoption and broad participation in production of the output. The IGF is uniquely positioned to accomplish this, given its multi-stakeholder approach and interest in policy options. As I contemplated on IGF, I noted the wealth of information on the public website and its immense educational value, especially to the developing world. It has its own challenges, but extremely valuable. I also observed that each event maintained a reporting back, a taking stock, a way forward, next step session, which were all attempts to capture some concrete understandings among participants. As the quality of dialogue improves, the outcomes become more concrete, incrementally, in an organic way. I also learned that the themes of the past 8 IGFs have varied and revealing to me. Though this is a small sample 8, it is interesting to know that the most used words in order were internet 6, development 5, governance 4, all 2, sustainable 2, and the rest of the words were single occurrences. Is the IGF silently saying that internet development governance by all sustainably? With several billions not yet on the internet, it will be advantageous to have new users become aware of IG issues promptly. Thus, the role of regional and national IGF organizations may evolve to a first point of contact on IG policy issues for a long time to come in countries. In that vein, the development and capacity to achieve this is needed in the evolution of IGF. Spread IGF's coverage across the world, and in especially where most new entrants will join the internet form, that is the developing world. One wishes the IGF Support Association initiative would succeed in bringing more resources and organizational capacity to IGF to fulfill these expectations while increasing the community ownership of the forum. We have come here on the legitimacy of the Secretary General of the UN as convener of IGF, which has enabled intergovernmental organizations, governments, and several other stakeholders to benefit from the multi-stakeholder approach to policy development as practiced at IGF. It has been good and urged the UN to extend the mandate of IGF as a concrete outcome. The IGF of past 8 years said that internet development governance by all sustainably. Assuming the all in the statement refers to the global internet community, one dare ask that we openly start discussions at next IGF on other organizational options to ensure that as long as the community wishes to continue with the process, we do continue. In fact, as we work towards more concrete outcomes, there is a need for permanence of IGF and the corresponding increase in community ownership of the forum. And at this point, I'd like to be very pragmatic. We would like to continue with IGF. So what happens if it's not extended? I think we should be discussing. We are all optimistic. We are working towards it. But in the event that that is not what the case is, I think we should be discussing how the forum becomes a community ownership forum. This has been an excellent place to share, learn, experience for new entrants, which has been great for me coming from the developing world. My takeaway from mere participation is best practices I adopt in my work will be concrete output for me, and I wish yours just as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nii, for those wise and inspiring words. Very much appreciate it. That brings today's session to a close. I'd like to just very quickly thank all of the lead experts for all of these best practices forum that have been working, and many of which will continue to work. I'd like to thank all the participants who helped to develop the documents, and everyone here today. I'd like to thank our consultants, Wout de Netris and John Laprise, for their work so far and ongoing work. I'd like to thank Constance Beaumelaire very much for really driving us to make this happen. It's not been an easy task, and she's been a slave driver. And again, thanks to everyone here.
Hocam bu saygı mı?